The air in the terminal was thick with the collective sigh of 100 delayed journeys. It was that special kind of tired that settled deep in the bones, a weariness born of recycled air, uncomfortable plastic chairs, and the constant, low-grade anxiety of travel. Most people were slumped over their phones, scrolling through endless feeds or typing out urgent emails, their faces illuminated by the cold, blue light. But one man was an exception, a tightly wound spring of energy in a room of slack strings. He was a man in his late 40s, dressed in a suit that looked like it had been tailored to within an inch of its life and cost more than most people's monthly rent. His shoes were so polished they gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and he paced back and forth in the small designated waiting area, his expensive watch clamped to his wrist like a shackle. Every 30 seconds he would tap the face of the watch, a sharp, angry little movement, as if he could physically urge time to move faster. He was on the phone, his voice a low, commanding bark that cut through the terminal's drone. "No, listen to me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The merger happens Friday. I don't care what the legal team says. Push it." "That's not a suggestion, it's an instruction." He hung up with a violent stab of his finger and resumed his pacing, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the crowd with a look of pure disdain, as if everyone else was simply an obstacle in his path, a few feet away. Leaning against a pillar and almost blending into it was another man. He was the polar opposite of the suited pacer. He seemed to be made of softer edges, dressed in a dark, well-worn hoodie that had seen better days, a pair of comfortable-looking jeans, and scuffed leather boots. His dark, curly hair was unruly, framing a face that was kind but etched with a deep, quiet weariness. He wasn't looking at a phone or a watch. His attention was completely absorbed by a thick, dog-eared paperback novel in his hands. He held the book with a gentle reverence, his thumb slowly caressing the corner of the page as he read. To the casual observer, he was just another anonymous traveler, perhaps a musician or a writer, someone who valued comfort over appearance. He had a backpack at his feet, worn and faded, and he stood with a slight slouch, as if trying to take up as little space in the world as possible. He was completely still, an island of calm in the sea of frantic energy, and he seemed utterly content in his own little world, a world that existed only between the pages of his book. He didn't seem to notice the man in the suit, or the announcements blaring over the speakers, or the general chaos of the terminal. He was just reading. Finally, a crisp voice came over the PA system, announcing the boarding for their flight. "We would now like to invite our first-class passengers and passengers requiring special assistance to begin boarding." The man in the suit snapped to attention, a look of relief on his face. He was the first in line, shouldering his way to the front of the small crowd that had formed, his carry-on, a sleek black roller, trailing obediently behind him. He presented his ticket to the gate agent with an air of expectation, as if she should recognize him and thank him for his business. She didn't. She just scanned his ticket and gave him a polite, neutral smile. The man in the hoodie, however, remained where he was. He slowly and carefully folded the corner of the page he was on, closed his book, and tucked it into his backpack. He waited until the majority of the crowd had boarded, joining the end of the line for the last boarding group. He moved with an unhurried grace, nodding a quiet thank you to the gate agent before disappearing down the jet bridge, inside the first-class cabin. The atmosphere was a little more refined, but no less tired. The air smelled of leather and a faint, citrusy scent from the air fresheners. The lights were dimmed, and most passengers were already settled into their wide, comfortable seats, their faces hidden behind sleep masks or the glow of their personal screens. The man in the suit found his seat, 4B, and immediately began to arrange his things, placing his laptop precisely on the fold-out tray and ordering a sparkling water from the flight attendant the moment she appeared. He continued his work, his fingers flying across the keyboard, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a man who needed to be busy, who defined his worth by his productivity. A few minutes later, the man in the hoodie boarded. He moved quietly down the aisle, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his eyes scanning for his seat. He found it in 4A, right next to the suit. He didn't seem to notice his seatmate at first, his focus on getting settled without disturbing anyone. He stowed his backpack in the overhead bin, a simple, worn canvas bag that looked out of place amongst the pristine, hard-shell suitcases. He then lowered himself into his seat, letting out a soft, almost inaudible sigh of relief. He pulled his book back out of his pocket, opened it to the marked page, and was immediately lost again, his posture relaxed, his entire being shrinking into the small, comfortable space of his chair. The final passengers trickled in, and the cabin doors began to close. A young flight attendant, her face a professional mask of calm despite the long day, was making her final checks. She was a petite woman, and she struggled for a moment with a heavy-looking roller bag that a passenger had asked her to stow. It was stuck at an awkward angle in the overhead bin, and she grunted softly as she tried to shift it. The man in the suit glanced up from his laptop, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He watched her for a moment, his expression one of clear disapproval, as if her struggle was a personal inconvenience to him. He made no move to help, simply tapping an impatient finger on his keyboard, ready to resume his work the moment she was out of his way. But then the man in the hoodie looked up from his book. He saw the flight attendant struggle, and without a moment's hesitation, he quietly marked his page, closed his book, and stood up. He moved into the aisle with a fluid, easy grace. "Here, let me get that," he said, his voice low and gentle. He reached up, and with a seemingly effortless strength, lifted the heavy bag and slid it securely into the bin. The flight attendant looked up at him, her professional mask slipping for a second to reveal a genuine, surprised smile. "Oh, thank you so much," she said, her voice filled with relief. "No problem at all," he replied with a small, kind smile of his own. He then sat back down in his seat, reopened his book, and was gone again, as if the small act of kindness had never happened. But it had, and the man in the suit had seen it all. The quiet moment in the first-class cabin was fragile, like a soap bubble, and it was just as quickly popped. The flight attendant, still holding on to the warm feeling from the simple act of kindness, moved on to her next task, her professional smile back in place. The man in the hoodie, however, had already retreated. His world had shrunk back to the 6 inches between his face and the pages of his book, the gentle drone of the plane systems a familiar lullaby. He was an island of tranquility, completely unaware of the storm he was about to create, or rather, the storm that was brewing within the man sitting just a foot away. The man in the suit let out a sharp, audible breath. It wasn't a sigh of relaxation. It was a sound of pure, distilled annoyance, like air escaping from a tire. He stared at his laptop screen, but the words and numbers had blurred into a meaningless jumble. All he could see was the replay of the event in his mind. The flight attendant struggling, the casual way the man in the hoodie had stood up, the effortless lift of the bag, the grateful smile. To him, it wasn't an act of kindness. It was a violation. It was a breakdown of the natural order of things. There were staff and there were passengers. The staff served and the passengers were served. The staff were there to handle luggage, to pour drinks, to be at the beck and call of people like him. A fellow passenger, especially one who looked like he did, stepping in to do their job. It was an insult to the system. It was an insult to him. He felt a strange, hot, prickling sensation on the back of his neck. It was the feeling of his own authority, an authority he had built and paid for, being subtly undermined. He couldn't let it go. The injustice of it festered in his mind like a splinter. He shifted in his plush leather seat, the expensive material creaking in protest. He glanced over at the man in the hoodie, who was now turning a page with a slow, deliberate motion. The sight of his calm profile, his focus entirely on the book, was like fuel to the fire. How could he be so serene? How could he not understand the rules? The businessman cleared his throat, a loud, artificial bark that was meant to command attention. The man in the hoodie didn't look up. He just kept reading. This was too much. The businessman had to say something. He had to re-establish the pecking order, if only for himself. He leaned slightly towards the aisle, ensuring his voice would carry not just to his seatmate, but to the rows around them. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. The word was coated in a thick layer of sarcasm. They let anyone in first class these days. Playing the hero for the help. He said it just loud enough for a woman in the row across to hear. She flinched, her eyes darting from the businessman to the man in the hoodie and back again before she quickly looked down at her phone, pretending to be absorbed in a game. She didn't want to get involved. No one ever does. The man in the hoodie finally stirred. He didn't look up from his book, but his reading paused. His thumb, which had been stroking the edge of the page, went still. He had heard. There was no way he couldn't have. But he gave no other sign. He remained a statue of quiet indifference, and this lack of reaction only infuriated the businessman more. He wanted a fight. He wanted an apology. He wanted the man to acknowledge his mistake, to understand that he had overstepped. He was met with nothing but silence. That's when he decided to go in directly. He turned his body, angling himself so he was facing the man in the hoodie. He lowered his voice, making it a sharp, cutting whisper that was more menacing than a shout. "Hey, buddy," he said, the word buddy hanging in the air like an insult. The man in the hoodie slowly lifted his head from his book, his eyes blinking once as if coming out of a deep trance. He looked at the businessman with a calm, open expression, a hint of confusion in his eyes, as if he couldn't quite understand why he was being spoken to. The businessman pressed on, emboldened by the eye contact. "Next time, let the staff do their jobs," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "That's what we pay them for." He leaned back, a smug, self-satisfied look on his face. He had said his piece. He had put the man in his place. He waited for the reaction. He expected a stammered apology or perhaps an angry retort, which he could then easily shut down. He was prepared for either outcome, but what he got was neither. The man in the hoodie simply looked at him for a long moment. He didn't seem angry or embarrassed. He just looked thoughtful. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if considering the man's point of view. Then, without saying a word, he looked back down at his book and resumed reading. The dismissal was absolute. It was a complete and total negation of the businessman's existence. It was as if he had been a gust of wind, a momentary annoyance that had now passed. The businessman's face flushed a deep, mottled red. His jaw worked silently, opening and closing like a fish out of water. He had been armed for a battle, and his opponent had simply laid down his weapon and walked away, leaving him shouting at empty air. The humiliation was sharp and immediate. He could feel the eyes of the woman across the aisle on him again, and this time he thought he saw a flicker of something else in her expression. Not fear, not respect. It was pity. The flight attendant, who had been watching the exchange from the galley area, decided to intervene. She walked over, her movements practiced and smooth. "Can I get you anything to drink before we take off, sir?" she asked, directing her question to the businessman. Her tone was perfectly professional, but her eyes held a coolness that hadn't been there before. The businessman stared at her, then at the back of the man in the hoodie's head. He wanted to scream. He wanted to demand that the man be thrown off the plane. But he couldn't. He had no grounds. The man hadn't done anything wrong. He had just not reacted. "No," the businessman snapped, turning back to his laptop. "Nothing." He jabbed at the keyboard, his fingers clumsy with rage. The words were still a blur. He could feel the rage boiling inside him, a hot, impotent fury. He had been made to feel small, foolish, and powerless, and it had happened right here, in first class, where he was supposed to be in control. The plane began to move, a slow, lumbering roll away from the gate. The captain's voice would soon come over the speakers, but for now, the only sound in the tense little bubble of seats, 4A and 4B, was the furious, silent tapping of a keyboard and the soft, rhythmic rustle of a turning page. The trap was set, and the players were in their places, unaware that the world was about to be turned upside down in a matter of seconds. The silence that followed was heavier than the plane itself. It was a thick, suffocating blanket woven from unspoken anger and quiet discomfort. In seat 4B, the businessman sat rigid, his body a coiled spring of rage. His fingers, which had been flying across his keyboard with such purpose, now lay still on the keys. He wasn't working anymore. He was replaying the scene in his mind over and over again. The quiet man's calm face, the slight nod, The way he had simply returned to his book as if the businessman were nothing more than a pesky fly buzzing around his head. The dismissal had been so complete, so absolute, that it felt like a physical blow. He had spent his entire life building a fortress of respect and authority around himself, a fortress made of expensive suits, sharp words, and the unwavering belief that he was better than most. And in 30 seconds, this man in a worn-out hoodie had dismantled it all without even raising his voice. He could feel the eyes of the woman across the aisle on him again. He didn't dare look at her, but he could feel her judgment like a physical weight. He imagined her telling the story later to her friends, her family. "You won't believe this jerk on the plane today." The thought made his stomach churn with a hot, acidic mix of fury and shame. He needed to do something, to reclaim his position, to show everyone that he was the one in control. He pressed the call button above his head, a sharp, insistent beep that cut through the cabin's quiet hum. He would complain. He would complain about the service, about the man in the hoodie, about anything he could think of. He would make someone pay for this feeling of powerlessness. The same young flight attendant who had been helped with the bag appeared at his side. Her expression perfectly neutral, but her eyes held a flicker of caution. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" she asked, her voice low and professional. Before he could speak, the plane began to move. A slow, gentle lurch as it disconnected from the jet bridge and started its journey along the tarmac. The movement was a welcome distraction. The businessman saw his opportunity. "This is unacceptable," he hissed, his voice a low whisper. The man next to me was harassing the staff. "He's a disturbance. I want to be moved." The flight attendant's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. She glanced at the man in the hoodie, who was still engrossed in his book, seemingly oblivious to the world around him. "Sir, I was there," she said, her voice firm but still polite. "He was simply helping me with a bag. There was no disturbance." "Don't lie to me," the businessman shot back, his voice rising slightly. "I saw the whole thing." He was overstepping. "It's completely inappropriate. I demand to speak to your superior. I want the captain." The flight attendant held his gaze for a moment, her professional mask firmly in place. "Of course, sir," she said, her tone devoid of any real commitment. "I will be sure to pass your concerns along. Now, we need to prepare for takeoff, so please ensure your seatbelt is fastened and your tray table is stowed." With that, she turned and walked back towards the galley, leaving him sputtering with impotent rage. He had been dismissed again. He slammed his laptop shut with a loud crack, the sound echoing in the quiet cabin. The woman across the aisle visibly jumped just as the businessman felt like he might explode from the sheer injustice of it all. The captain's voice crackled over the PA system. It was a calm, friendly voice, the kind of voice that inspired confidence and made you feel like you were in good hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. First, I'd like to welcome you aboard and thank you for flying with us today. Our flight time to New York will be approximately 5 hours and 20 minutes. And we're looking at a smooth ride and clear skies all the way." It was the standard, boring pre-flight announcement, and most people barely listened. The businessman stared out the window, watching the lights of the airport blur past as the plane picked up speed. He was still fuming, his mind racing with a dozen different complaints he could file, a dozen different ways he could make someone's life miserable. He was so lost in his own anger that he almost missed the change in the captain's tone. "I also have a special note before we depart," the captain continued, his voice becoming warmer, more personal. "We are incredibly privileged to have a very distinguished guest flying with us today. He's a man who is not only a world-renowned artist, but also a significant investor in aviation and, in fact, the principal owner of this airline." A few heads lifted from their phones and magazines. The phrase "principal owner of this airline" had a way of grabbing people's attention. The businessman scoffed to himself. Great, some billionaire big shot. Probably sitting in a private suite up front. "Not crammed in here with the rest of them," the captain's voice continued, filled with a genuine respect that was unmistakable. "He's a man who prefers to travel quietly, often without any fuss, blending in with our other passengers. He believes that everyone deserves to be treated with kindness and respect, a value we try to embody as a crew. On behalf of the entire crew, I want to extend our sincerest gratitude. Mr. Reeves, it's an honor to have you on board. Thank you for flying with us. The name hung in the air for a moment, Mr. Reeves. A stunned silence fell over the first-class cabin, followed by a wave of excited murmuring. Craning necks and curious eyes scanned the section, searching for the reclusive billionaire owner. Who was it? The old man in the corner with the newspaper? The young tech bro with the expensive headphones? The flight attendant who had spoken to the businessman was standing in the galley, and a knowing, gentle smile played on her lips. She looked directly at seat 4A, following her gaze, every head turned, and there he was. The man in the worn hoodie. The man with the scuffed boots and the dog-eared paperback. The man who had helped with a bag and then been bullied for his trouble. Keanu Reeves looked up from his book, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He seemed to shrink under the weight of everyone's attention, his cheeks flushing a deep shade of crimson. He gave a small, embarrassed nod toward the cockpit. A silent plea for the captain to stop, then slumped lower in his seat. Wishing the floor would open up and swallow him whole, the collective gaze then shifted to 4B. The color had completely drained from the businessman's face. It was as if someone had pulled a plug inside him, and all the arrogance and self-importance had drained away, leaving a pale, hollow shell. His jaw was slack, his mouth slightly agape. He stared at Keanu, then at the flight attendant, then back at Keanu, the full weight of his previous words. His actions, his entire attitude, crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just been rude to a fellow passenger. He hadn't just been a jerk to some random guy in a hoodie. He had publicly mocked and belittled Keanu Reeves. The Keanu Reeves. The man who, according to the captain, owned the very plane they were on. The man who could probably buy and sell his entire company with the loose change in his pocket. The smug entitlement was gone, replaced by a raw, palpable shame so intense it felt like a physical burn. He was no longer a man in a suit. He was a fool. And everyone knew it. The silence that followed the captain's announcement was not a peaceful one. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, thick with shock and dawning realization. It was the sound of 100 people collectively holding their breath. In the first-class cabin, time seemed to slow down, stretching each second into an eternity. The low hum of the engines, once a comforting drone, now sounded like a low, mocking laugh, a soundtrack to the businessman's personal apocalypse. His world, which just moments ago had been a fortress of control and self-importance, had just been obliterated. He could feel the physical sensation of his life crumbling. A cold sweat bloomed on his forehead, and his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The expensive, tailored suit he was so proud of suddenly felt like a costume, a ridiculous outfit he'd worn to a party where he was the only one who didn't know the theme. The fabric felt scratchy and tight, constricting him, choking him. He was acutely aware of every single person on the plane. He could feel their eyes on him, not with respect or fear, but with a kind of morbid curiosity, the way people might stare at a car crash. He was the spectacle. He was the fool. His mind raced, desperately trying to rewind time, to take back the words. "Hey, buddy." The phrase echoed in the cavern of his shame, each syllable a fresh stab of humiliation. Let the staff do their jobs. He remembered the smugness in his own voice, the absolute certainty that he was in the right, that he was teaching a lesson to someone who didn't know his place. And now the irony was so crushing it felt like a physical weight on his chest. He was the one who didn't know his place. He had been a peacock, strutting and preening, only to realize he was in a lion's den. And he had just kicked the lion in the shin. He didn't dare look at the man in the hoodie. He couldn't. To see his face would be to confirm the nightmare. But he could feel him. He could feel the quiet presence beside him, a presence that now had the weight of an entire airline behind it. The man hadn't said a word. He hadn't even looked at him. He had just slumped lower in his seat, a picture of mortified embarrassment. And in that the businessman felt a new, strange emotion, pity. Not for himself, but for the man next to him. He hadn't wanted this. The captain's announcement meant as an honor, was clearly a form of torture for a man who just wanted to be left alone to read his book. And he, the businessman, had been the catalyst for this entire, excruciatingly public scene across the aisle. The woman who had witnessed the entire exchange was no longer pretending to be absorbed in her phone. She was staring openly, her mouth slightly agape. Her eyes flickered between the businessman's pale, rigid profile and the back of the movie star's head. A slow smile was forming on her lips, not a cruel smile, but one of deep, profound satisfaction. It was the smile of someone who loves to see justice served, and it was being served on a silver platter at 30,000 feet. She had seen his arrogance, and now she was seeing his downfall. It was a perfect, poetic circle. The young flight attendant, who had been the target of the businessman's misplaced anger, was now the picture of professional grace. She had a small, knowing smile as she moved down the aisle, but her eyes were kind. She stopped at row 4, her attention focused solely on the man in the hoodie. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice soft and respectful. "Can I get you anything? A water? Perhaps a more comfortable pillow? Anything at all." The offer was simple, but its meaning was immense. It was a public declaration of where the power now lay. The man in the hoodie, Keanu, finally looked up, his face still flushed. He gave the flight attendant a look of quiet gratitude. "No, I'm okay, thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Really? But thank you." He then did something that stunned the businessman even more. He looked at him, not with anger or smugness or triumph. He looked at him with a gentle, almost sad expression, as if to say, "It's okay. I'm not angry." And then he looked away, his gaze turning to the window, watching the lights of the city shrink below them. That small act of kindness was the final blow. It would have been easier if Keanu had gloated or had him thrown off the plane. But this quiet pity, this forgiveness, was a kind of judgment that was far more severe. It confirmed that he wasn't even worth being angry at. He was just a sad, pathetic man who had made a fool of himself. The plane began to pick up speed, roaring down the runway. The businessman gripped the armrests, his knuckles white. He wasn't afraid of flying, but he was terrified of what came next. The ascent was a physical manifestation of his own discomfort. As the plane lifted off the ground, his stomach dropped, and he felt a dizzying sense of unreality. He was trapped in a metal tube with the man he had publicly humiliated, a man who now held his fate in his hands. He could have him blacklisted from every airline in the country. He could buy his company and fire him on the spot. The possibilities were endless, and each one was more terrifying than the last dot once the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dinged off. The cabin slowly returned to a state of normalcy, but it was a new kind of normal. The other passengers began to talk in hushed whispers, stealing glances at the back of the famous actor's head. The flight attendant brought Keanu a bottle of water and a warm towel without him even asking. The businessman, however, had become invisible. He was a ghost in his own seat. No one looked at him. No one spoke to him. The flight attendant didn't ask if he needed anything. He was now the one being ignored, the one whose presence was an inconvenience. He had spent his life trying to command attention, and now that he had it, he would have given anything to be invisible. He closed his eyes, but all he could see was the captain's smiling face and the man in the hoodie's kind, pitying eyes. The flight had just begun, but for him it was already the longest journey of his life. The next few hours of the flight were the longest of the businessman's life. Time, which he had always tried to control and conquer, now stretched out before him like an endless, punishing road. He remained frozen in his seat, a statue carved from shame. The plush leather felt like it was swallowing him whole, and the cabin, once a symbol of his status, now felt like a prison cell. He didn't look out the window. He didn't try to work on his laptop. He just stared at the seat back in front of him, his mind a chaotic storm of regret and fear. Every creak of the plane, every rustle of a snack wrapper, every distant cough from another passenger sounded like a personal accusation. He was acutely aware of the quiet man beside him, not as a person, but as a force field of silent judgment. He could feel the gentle rise and fall of Keanu's breathing, a calm, steady rhythm that was the complete opposite of his own frantic, Shallow gasps, the flight attendant moved through the cabin with a renewed sense of purpose. She would stop by Keanu's row every so often, offering a fresh drink, a magazine, a warm cookie. Each time she would completely ignore the businessman, her gaze sliding over him as if he were an empty seat. This professional, silent treatment was more excruciating than any angry words could have been. It was a clear, undeniable message: you do not matter. He, who had always demanded to be the center of attention, was now a ghost, and the invisibility was a form of torture. About 2 hours into the flight, as the sun began to set outside the small oval window, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Keanu shifted in his seat. The businessman flinched, bracing himself for something, anything. But Keanu wasn't looking at him. He was looking out the window at the spectacular view. After a moment, he turned his head slightly, his voice a low, quiet murmur. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" The businessman was so stunned he couldn't speak. He just nodded, a jerky, unnatural motion. He couldn't believe the man was speaking to him, let alone making small talk. It was an act of such profound kindness, such a complete lack of malice that it almost broke him. Keanu wasn't trying to rub it in. He was just being a person, sharing a moment of beauty with another human being. The businessman felt a lump form in his throat, and for the first time in years, he felt the sting of tears. He quickly turned his head to the window, not to see the sunset, but to hide his face. He saw the colors now, really saw them, and they felt like a glimpse into a world he had forgotten existed. A world where things like beauty and kindness mattered more than money and power. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came over the PA system again, this time with the standard arrival information. The businessman knew his time was running out. He had to say something. The shame was a physical poison, and the only antidote was an apology, however clumsy and inadequate it might be. His heart pounded against his ribs as he rehearsed the words in his head. He had spent his life crafting perfect, cutting sentences to get what he wanted, but now the simplest words felt impossible to form. The wheels of the plane touched down with a gentle bump, followed by the roar of the thrust reversers. As the plane taxied to the gate, the businessman took a deep, shaky breath. He turned to Keanu, who was already putting his worn book away into his backpack. I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. It was raw and cracked, stripped of all its usual arrogance. "For earlier, I was a jerk. There's no excuse. I'm just sorry." Keanu stopped what he was doing and looked at him. He didn't look triumphant or smug. He just looked tired and maybe a little sad. He held the businessman's gaze for a long moment, a silence that stretched on for an eternity. Then he gave a small, slow nod. "Hey, don't worry about it," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "We all have our moments. It's forgotten." Forgotten. The word landed with the weight of a benediction. It wasn't just a dismissal. It was a pardon. The businessman felt a wave of relief so powerful it left him feeling weak. He hadn't been forgiven because he was powerful or important. He had been forgiven simply because he had asked for it. It was a lesson he had never learned in all his years of climbing the corporate ladder. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the cabin erupted with the familiar sounds of people gathering their things. The businessman, desperate to escape, was the first one on his feet. He fumbled with his sleek carry-on, his hands clumsy. He didn't look at Keanu again. He just wanted to vanish. He scurried into the aisle and practically ran down the jet bridge, not stopping until he was safely hidden in the anonymity of the airport terminal. His expensive suit feeling like a hair shirt, Keanu, however, took his time. He waited until the aisle was clear, then stood up and stretched. He walked to the front of the plane, where the flight attendant and the other crew members were gathered. He spoke to them in a low voice for a few minutes, a warm, genuine smile on his face. He thanked them for their hard work and for making the flight so pleasant. He then slipped a folded piece of paper into the lead flight attendant's hand. It wasn't just a thank you note. It was a generous check for the entire crew, a small gesture of his immense appreciation for people who did their jobs with grace and kindness, With a final, humble nod to the crew, he shouldered his worn backpack and walked off the plane. Just another passenger in a hoodie, disappearing into the crowd. The flight attendant watched him go, then looked down at the note in her hand, a quiet satisfaction settling in her heart. In the world of air travel, it seemed, and perhaps in the world at large, kindness truly was first class. And somewhere in the bustling airport, a man in a very expensive suit was learning that lesson the hard way, a lesson he would likely never, ever forget.